Hi everyone, my name's Caitlin McGrath and I'm a meteorologist at WUSA 9. Thank you so much for participating in our STEM for Her Earth Day celebration. To honor Earth Day today, we're going to have a great discussion about climate change and how it's impacting the Washington, D.C. area. This is such an important topic and a timely topic that's impacting everyone, from rising sea levels to more frequent flooding and days with extreme heat, even poor air quality, just to name a few. There are so many ways that climate change is impacting our lives. But before we dive into that, I do want to tell you a little bit more about my role as a meteorologist. So welcome to my office. My workspace at WUSA 9 is actually in the studio. This is where the entire weather team works out of. Since we require specific software to make our weather graphics and forecast, it's just easier if we can work in the same space where we go on TV from. Over here at my desk is where I spend most of my day, going through weather models, analyzing satellite data, and coming up with the forecast. Well, I know you can look at your phone and just check the weather. That's just one model's output of what the weather might be. We look at dozens of computer models and various data to come up with DC's most accurate forecast. Once I have the forecast fine-tuned, I make up my weather graphics. My weather graphics system allows me to make a presentation of everything that you see on TV about the weather and my forecast. Every graphic that you see is something that the weather team has put together ourselves. Once my weather graphics are all set, it's showtime. We have a number of different areas in the studio where we present the news from. The anchors typically sit here at the anchor desk, but there are a number of different presentation options in the studio for our anchors and reporters. We have a weather center shot that you'll see us at occasionally, but we present most of our information from this big monitor here, or my favorite spot, the green screen, which is quite literally green. There's behind the scenes magic in our control room where they're able to program our weather graphics to show up where you see the green screen here. But that also means that we're not actually looking at our weather graphics behind us. We look at these side TVs so that we can see what you see at home to make it look like our weather graphics are actually behind us. And a fun fact, meteorologists don't read scripts. Everything you hear us say is just knowledge that we've prepared and have locked away in our brain. If you have any questions about my role as a meteorologist, feel free to reach out. You can find my contact information on WUSA9.com. But first, I had the pleasure of talking to two really important women in the field of environmental conservation and climate change.
I am so excited to introduce Beth Mcgee, the Director of Science and Agricultural Policy at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and Alyssa Acco, a Senior Climate Scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. We are so lucky to be hearing from both of these women today because they both have very prominent roles as scientists in our community, and climate change is impacting both of their jobs, but their positions are each very unique. So Beth and Alyssa, thank you so much for joining me today for this important conversation. To start, I'd like each of you to take a few minutes to introduce yourself and talk about how you got to the position that you're in today. Beth, we'll start with you.
Great, thanks. Really happy to be here with you today. I'm with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which is a nonprofit environmental advocacy and education group that's been around since 1967, headquartered in Annapolis. And I've been at the Bay Foundation since 2003, where I started as what we call a scientist in our Maryland office, which deals with primarily legislative and regulatory issues in Maryland, and then moved up into my regional position a couple of years after that. Prior to coming to the nonprofit world, I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Maryland Department of the Environment, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so all governmental agencies doing science and research and some policy work. And then since coming to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, I mostly do work on, policy, understanding the Clean Water Act, agriculture. The Farm Bill, for example, is a really big piece of legislation that funds a lot of agricultural conservation. So, moving more into the policy space now, which is where I am right now.
And is this always something that you wanted to do with your life, Beth?
Yes, actually, I can remember when I was about 10 years old, getting a solicitation letter from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. We are famous for our bumper stickers that say "Save the Bay." And I remember thinking when I got that, wow, that might be a really cool place to work. I lived in Delaware at the time, and then lo and behold, fast forward 40 years later or so, arrived at the Bay Foundation. So I've always been passionate about the environment and find that my job is a great mix of my knowledge of science, my passion and advocacy.
A very important reminder that, even at these young ages, it's never too early to start thinking about the path you want your life to take. Thank you so much, Beth. And Alyssa, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I work as a scientist, also at an environmental advocacy organization that was also founded in 1967. And our primary focus right now is to address the current climate change crisis. And so I work with lawyers, policy experts, economists, analysts, and other scientists to find the most effective ways to reduce emissions of heat trapping gases, but to also build resilience to the changes we are already experiencing and expecting in the future. So I've always loved math and science, which is what initially led me to pursue higher level education in science and engineering. But it wasn't until I went to college that I learned about climate change. So my life passion is something that I wasn't even aware of when I was your age. And so I was immediately intrigued by evidence that Earth's climate is changing, that it is due to human activities, and that it impacts all life on Earth. I even traveled with students to Greenland and got to experience firsthand the massive melting of ice taking place in the Arctic due to higher temperatures. And that's where I knew that I found my calling. And I wanted to pursue a career in trying to help save the world from climate change. So I then went on to earn a PhD in climate science with the goal of eventually working at the intersection of climate change science, policy, and communication. And so the reason why I wanted that intersection was because I really wanted to help turn science into action. And so that's where I am today. And I lead our climate science team at Environmental Defense Fund.
It's so cool already to see the similarities and the differences in your roles. So I'm really excited for this conversation. And while we have made great progress as women in the field of science, that wasn't always the case. So Alyssa, I want you to talk a little bit about how you really persevered and paved the way as a female in science, and talk about some of the struggles that you dealt with along the way, and more importantly, how you overcame them.
Absolutely. I mean, hearing myself give an overview of my background makes it all sound so easy and like I knew what I wanted to do, and so I did it. But I assure everyone it certainly was not. There was a lot of doubt, stress, uncertainty. But at the end of the day, my passion and determination really carried me through, and I'm really grateful for sticking with things and not quitting. Forcing myself to go through some of the challenges that I went through to really make it to where I wanted to be. For example, by earning a PhD and also, having this career that I, always dreamed of. I think one of the biggest struggles that I've dealt with that relates to particularly being a female in science or engineering is the feeling that I always needed to prove myself, and this worry that I'm not taken seriously. And this is especially true for me because I'm a very feminine female. I love makeup and fashion. And so I felt like I never really fit in, even with females in science and engineering, which was kind of isolating at times. So sometimes, these concerns are just in my mind. They're not real. They're just worries. But sometimes, there are cases where I definitely felt like, I felt that people weren't taking me seriously. When I started grad school, people called me ditzy because I was very bubbly. Those things were really hard to overcome. And on one hand, this insecurity gave me the determination to show what I'm capable of and to prove everyone wrong. And that really helped drive me to where I am. So I'm very grateful for that. But on the other hand, this insecurity made me fear failure because I felt like if I messed up, then everyone would feel like, see, we knew she wasn't in the right place and shouldn't be here. So that has always been really hard on my confidence, and can still to this day make me shy away from opportunities where I might make myself vulnerable to messing up. So overcoming this challenge will be a life journey. I know that. But what has really helped me is focusing on my strengths. I have a lot of weaknesses. We all do, but I am equally aware of where I can shine and contribute in ways that others can't. And so that's what really gives me confidence.
Thank you so much for that important reminder. And I hope that, by the time all of you watching grow up, that this isn't even a part of the conversation, that, we are equal across all boards in all fields. But I think that is such an important reminder that, confidence is key. You have to know your own strengths and you have to pursue them. Sometimes it might not feel like you belong in a space, but it's so important to remember that you really do. So thank you so much for that, Alyssa. And I want to continue on this topic for just a few more minutes because you really have set yourself apart in the climate change space for communicating. And it's so important because it is such a complex topic. Talk about how you've set yourself apart in terms of making these really broad, big, kind of scary ideas seem so easy to understand to the general public.
It's typically a combination of using really plain language and making it relatable. So you have to consider your audience in terms of what they care about, and that may be the economy, health, coastal properties. But because climate change literally affects everything, it really isn't hard to just pick one aspect that your audience cares about and focus on how climate change affects that. And that's how you get them interested. But then regardless of the age of the audience or even the knowledge base, I always stay away from technical terms. I aim to make the youngest person or least knowledgeable person in the room able to understand what I'm saying. And so I used to, think that made me look, not smart. But at this stage, I don't care if it is too simple for more advanced people. I want everyone to understand. And so another thing that I really care about is designing science graphics. I'm the daughter of an artist. So I love combining science and art and creating these powerful visuals that can explain complex concepts in a visually compelling way that is both easy to follow and remember. So that's something that I utilize a lot in presentations, and I love storytelling. So I try to engage an audience with this like cohesive narrative that they can follow, minimalist in a way, but really compelling visuals that aren't overwhelming, but they kind of like tell this story, and you can take people on a journey with you. So that's kind of, the overall recipe I tend to follow.
No, very interesting and very relatable to meteorology. You're speaking my language. We were telling a story, breaking down information. And that's one thing that's really changed, I think, in my career over the past several years is it used to be the people at home don't really care about why the weather is what it is. They just care what the forecast is going to be. But I think people are so hungry for knowledge these days that we have been given the opportunity to really kind of break down the why. More in terms of our forecast. So those are really interesting to make those connections. And I love that you're very visual because Beth, you kind of from a different visual perspective are seeing the impacts of climate change firsthand along the Chesapeake Bay. So talk about some of the biggest impacts that climate change is having in and within the Chesapeake Bay.
Sure. So really three big impacts of climate change for sea level rise. And the interesting thing, or one interesting thing, is that in this region, not only are the seas rising, but the land is also sinking from something that happened in the glacial period. So we have in this area somewhere around 2 times the global average, which makes us very susceptible to sea level rise. So what does that look like? If people live anywhere along the shoreline, they're seeing it. They're seeing trees fall into the water. They're seeing their wetlands get submerged. They're seeing, houses that used to be pretty far from the water now closer. So that's all sort of a very visible, tangible thing that we are seeing in this region in a big way. We're losing islands, that are disappearing from the region. Another big difference is water temperature. And again, we are seeing not only in the bay proper, where we have a pretty good long-term record of water temperatures, and we've seen them increase over time, which is a problem for the critters that live in the bay that maybe don't like really warm water. But we also see similar patterns happening in streams and rivers that are feeding the bay. Overall, the temperatures are up in our streams when you look at changes over time. And again, that stresses animals like trout that like really cold water and freshwater systems. And the last, I think, really obvious impact of climate change is we're seeing more severe storms. So we're seeing these huge rainfalls, and from the Chesapeake Bay perspective, that means a lot of pollution. When it's rainy, a lot of pollution gets washed into the bay, and so that is another stress on our system, and it also causes flooding. We've had horrific flooding events in Maryland in particular. So it's again something visually you can see. When we get those storms, are often more severe, a lot more rainfall, et cetera, happening over a very short period of time.
Absolutely. And talk about such a change over the past several years. And part of me is thankful because I think now that we are seeing these impacts of climate change firsthand so frequently and so visually that I think it is waking a lot of people up to the action that needs to be taken. And we are speaking right now to the future generation that is hopefully going to help us continue to mitigate the impacts of climate change and make some really big changes. So what are the things that these girls can look for and do in their communities that will help mitigate climate change and help save the Chesapeake Bay?
So a couple things is one is anytime we use electricity or burn fossil fuels in our cars, that is not only that's adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, greenhouse gas, it's also adding nitrogen pollution to the bay. So if you do a better job of electricity, using your electricity, driving your parents, encouraging them to drive less or whatever, that's something, a tangible thing that's not only good for the bay but good for climate change. But in our own backyard, I work in the agricultural space, and there's a lot of interest in the role that agriculture can play in mitigating greenhouse gases. And one of the ways that a lot of folks are looking at is to create soils that are healthy. So farmland that is very healthy, meaning there's a lot of organic matter, and that can actually sequester carbon. And a similar thing can happen in your own yard. For example, if you have a garden, and you add compost, which is organic matter. You want a healthy soil is sort of dark in color, smells very rich. Like if you go into a forest, you smell that kind of really organic smell. That's what we want to see. And that is, again, because soils have an ability to store carbon in them. If we have healthier soils, whether it's on a farmland or whether it's in your backyard, that's actually sort of helping with climate change.
And that tees us up perfectly for the Earth Day Challenge kits that all of these girls received at home. They all received seed packets and gardening kits because we really hope to inspire everyone and educate them on exactly what you just said, that agriculture is such an important part of keeping our air healthy. So talk a little bit more about, you mentioned the soil and what to look for, but talk a little bit more about the benefits that agriculture and even just your own personal garden can do for our air and for our earth.
Sure. So I like the two sides to every coin, and as I mentioned, agriculture is it's greenhouse gases. It actually is a main source of pollution to the bay, which is what the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is focused on, saving the bay. But the flip side of that is that many of the practices that we want farmers to do, whether it's build healthy soils by planting winter crops, by putting in forested buffers, have a dual benefit to both water quality and climate change. So they're helping reduce pollution to the bay, and at the same time, they're either helping sequester carbon or just reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. So that's a tangible benefit, and there's a lot of interest at the federal level in, like I said, in climate, or in agricultural's role in climate change. And similarly, in your, as I said, in your own backyard, if you have healthy soils, healthy yard, your gardens are healthy, that can really help do your own part really to fight climate change. And there's other things to do. I'm sure Alyssa's got tons of ideas for ways that folks can really take personal action. The other thing I will mention is that, related to that, on our webpage we have folks are probably used to seeing carbon footprint calculators that estimate your carbon footprint. We have a nitrogen footprint calculator, nitrogen being, again, one of the main pollutants that's affecting the bay, that operates very similarly and will give you tips on how to reduce your nitrogen footprint, which, again, there's a lot of overlap with what produces nitrogen and what produces fossil fuels. So again, there'd be dual benefits to doing some of the things, and you can find it on the Bay Foundation's webpage.
Very cool. And I do want to take a minute to acknowledge that we are talking about some really big, really complex topics that can seem, even to us as adults, overwhelming. But we do want to assure you that everything we're talking about is so manageable at every age level. And Beth, we had a previous conversation where you had really inspired me by a group of young girls that took action in their community. So do you mind sharing that story?
Sure. So we have an office in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is actually one of the bigger states that who runs eventually into the Chesapeake Bay. And a couple of years ago, we had a group of high school students take on the idea of trying to get the hellbender, which is an aquatic stream critter that's very big and very slimy, but also needs good water quality in order to survive, to get the hellbender listed as the Pennsylvania state salamander. So they met with their elected officials. they're the members of their legislation, and eventually that bill passed. And so now the hellbender is now the Pennsylvania salamander. And I say that because we do a lot of advocacy. We encourage people to contact their elected officials, whether it's at the county level, whether it's at the federal level, and students can do that too. I mean, that is one of the more impactful things that you can do if you care about the environment, is to let your elected officials know. Now, you might not be able to vote yet, but you will. And the fact that, again, these students were able to pass this legislation means there is sort of power to the people.
Excellent. Just one example of one of the ways that you can make a change. I know your kids, I know it might not seem like, something that's attainable, but proof there that it is. So Alyssa, I do want to turn to you now and talk about some ways that you believe these girls can make changes in their community.
Definitely. I mean, I think overall, there's a lot of big, massive changes that need to happen at, unprecedented scale and speed at these higher levels of government, and, regionally, nationally, internationally. So we do need those things to happen. But on, an individual level, I mean, what Beth was saying, there's a lot of things that you can do to, fight for action, and especially by, bringing your voice into the conversation and making people aware that you care about this on an individual community level that's what we really need. So it's beyond just day-to-day changes. And there's certain things that you can do in your own home. Some are, more impactful than others. For example, another benefit of the composting that Beth was saying is that you're also diverting food waste away from landfills. That is a big contribution to methane emissions in the atmosphere. Methane is another powerful greenhouse gas, and it actually accounts for more than a quarter of the warming that we're experiencing today. So there are a lot of these dual benefit options, and by educating your parents about it, or by taking action yourself to, make sure that you're, doing these types of actions is really helpful. But I think just talking about climate change in general, getting people passionate about it, aware of what's going on, is really what's needed to inspire action and to show our, elected officials and decision makers and policy makers that this is something we really care about and we want change, because a lot of change needs to come from that higher level. But other things that are really important, electric vehicles, trying to transition away from, the gasoline vehicles to hybrids or electric vehicles. So trying to encourage your parents to do that. Solar panels on your roof, really, those are the big ticket items that can make a big difference. And then also just, being a consumer of, any kind of product you purchase, being mindful of the climate impact is really important. And that's something you can also encourage your families to, to adopt and really look for those, those items that are climate friendly and eco-friendly when you're buying things, because what that's doing is that's telling the businesses that you care about that. And that's really important to encourage those businesses to make the changes needed. Because again, and I'll keep saying this, we need a lot of change at those higher levels.
Absolutely. So thank you, Alyssa and Beth, for both talking about some of the ways that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change from many different perspectives. I think that really helps kind of put a spark in our brain, thinking of, the next time we see a big heavy rain event and we have flooding, that we can, correlate it to climate change. So I do want to ask both of you this question, but Alyssa, I'll start with you. What are your biggest concerns for the future if we don't mitigate climate change? And thankfully, we are taking so many great actions as, a community, as a nation, and beyond, to help curb our carbon emissions and hopefully not undo what we've done, but help slow it down in the future. What is your biggest concern if we don't continue to take these actions?
I think the impacts of climate change don't affect everyone equally. And there are certain people and groups of people that are more vulnerable than others. And those are also the communities that are contributing the least to causing this global climate crisis. So one of my biggest concerns is that, we don't act fast enough, we don't do enough, and then it harms those people more, and in a way that's far away from us, that we don't have to, think about day to day. And so I really worry for those communities that, that live on small islands in the Pacific Ocean, for example, or live in really hot areas and they work outside, and it becomes, a major health issue to continue working outside. So we need to constantly think about those vulnerable populations, and, put them first, because they're getting hit hardest by climate change. And, and we can't, just because a lot of us don't interact with those populations on a day-to-day, we need to put them first and think about them as we scale up all of our solutions to address climate change, because I'm just really concerned about, just these vulnerable communities that will get hit the hardest if we don't do enough.
Absolutely. And we're already seeing that in so many ways in terms of air pollution and air quality and asthma and all these health impacts that we don't even realize. The United Nations Health Agency just released a report that almost all of us breathe air that's unhealthy. So if that's not inspiration to really take action and do our part individually, which again might seem small, but it does add up, I don't know what it is. So Beth, I do want to turn to you now, because the Bay is resilient, of that much we know. But what are your biggest concerns, and I would say biggest hopes? We want this to be a hopeful conversation too, right? What do you think about the future of the Bay?
Cautiously optimistic. I think we wouldn't be environmental advocates if we didn't have some level of optimism. So there are, some signs that the Bay is improving when you look at long-term trends in terms of reducing pollution and restoring dissolved oxygen, which is the dead zone that we're trying to prohibit. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but climate change is real. As I mentioned, we're going to need to do more just to stay in place to save the Bay, because of the warmer water, because of more severe storms. And so we really need to accelerate our efforts on climate change, which again will have dual benefits to the Bay, because of the globe. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, but we've got a long way to go, for both from the climate change perspective as well as saving the Bay.
Absolutely. And I do hope everyone watching is maybe feeling a little inspired to do their part and help preserve their community. So Beth, talk about a few ways that people can volunteer with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, because there are so many ways that are local and really impactful.
Yeah, great. So this time of year, we do a lot of work with farmers planting trees, typically along streamside, so that we can reduce pollution, but they're also, like I said, they're great for climate change. So there's opportunities if you go to our webpage to find out when our upcoming tree plantings are, and get out there and get your hands a little dirty and put some trees in the ground. We have an oyster center where we actually raise oysters at a different time of year. We need volunteers often to help us do various things with the oysters, get them ready to go out there and planted. So those are, I think, two of the big ways that folks can help out at the Bay Foundation, but you can find more on our webpage. And as I said, I think Leslie and I will both agree that really expressing your voice and concern for the environment to whoever will listen, including especially elected officials, it can be very, very important as well.
Absolutely. Never underestimate the power of your own voice, no matter how young or old. And Alyssa, what do you hope that everyone watching takes away from our conversation today? And how would you encourage them to take action in their community?
Never give up on yourself or on people around you or on the climate. It's never too late to act. Every little thing we do will make a difference. Every fraction of a degree that we can avoid will make a difference and be important. So sometimes we hear that we only have 10 years to act, but it's like everything we are able to do will help us. So don't be discouraged. And, I'm so lucky to be surrounded by so many colleagues that are brilliant and passionate. And so I see, firsthand every day, all the people that are working towards finding solutions. And I'm so encouraged by, the younger generation and how active they already are. So it's really exciting, and I'm very optimistic for the future, and the power of the human mind and solving these great challenges and making giant leaps forward in advancing our society. We've done that before. We've done, the ones were thought crazy things, flying in an airplane, cell phone. I mean, it's amazing what we can accomplish when we put our mind to things. And so I have a lot of hope that we will work towards, a better future and make major breakthroughs that are needed. And again, yeah, it's never too late to act. And so everything that we can do will help. And so, yeah, thank you guys so much for all of your interest in talking about this. I mean, that alone is a big step.
I can't wait to see what you guys watching come up with in the next several 10, 20, 30 years. Like you said, like flying in airplanes, you guys are going to blow our minds one day. I know it. So thank you guys so much. I know we unpacked a lot of information, but it is so important. And hopefully the conversation is really just getting started. So Alyssa and Beth, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yep, thanks.